everybody. Thanks for joining me for another one-man review. Today, I'll be taking a look at the re-release of the first volume of the complete Crepax that has Dracula, Frankenstein, and other horror stories, basically Valentina-related horror stories. We've talked about Guido Crepax a number of times on the channel. I've talked about the complete Crepax work as something I really enjoy. First off, these are some of the most gorgeously designed books I have. They're just absolutely beautiful. The stuff that they're doing with texture, I don't know how much that comes on screen, but each one has a really sophisticated color palette on the cover, and then there's a custom texture on each one that's printed in, and it's different for each book. So there's like a unifying visual but also variation in it that's really, really nice throughout these books. I think the overall package of these books is very sexy, which is very appropriate given that Crepax is obviously most famous as someone who is engaged in making erotic comics, erotica, but a lot of really awesome historical context. Again, I don't normally take the time to read these things just because I don't have much time. I know it seems like I must given how many videos we put out, but to keep putting the videos out, I have to read as fast as possible. So I'm not reading these things, but I am paying attention. Like, this is his wife here. This is a movie star that he liked. And it's very obvious that Valentina is based on both his wife and this star. I don't know if he's like making her cut her hair like that or what, but he had a look that he liked and it shows up in his art. And I think that's cool. You know, they seem like there. I did peek a little bit at an interview with his kids, and the photos and stuff, they look like a pretty healthy family. She seems to really enjoy playing along with all of this stuff. So he has his muse, and that's awesome. I think every artist wants that, and he definitely got it. In previous reviews of the complete Crepax stuff, I've focused pretty much just on the art, and my opinion had been that, anytime I've talked about this before, is that the art's great. I look at it for the compositions and all of that. But when it comes to the story, I've always found the stories kind of impenetrable or not that interesting to me. For some reason, I really felt like I wanted to go back. Maybe it's just because I have the first volume now. It doesn't really matter because they're not put in chronological order. But this volume was unavailable for a long time. It's back in print now. So, I mean, I don't know. I'd read it like a digital version of it. And every time I've tried to read Crepax stuff before, I can't like latch onto it. But for some reason, I was feeling like going back to it. And I'm enjoying it this time. So I wanted to go through. Maybe I'll do another volume. Maybe I won't. I'll see what I have to say about other volumes. But really, really do a deep dive and really try and figure out what this artist is up to, not just formally, but in terms of what he's saying with his stories. And also looking, closer. It's easier for me to notice all of the cool formal stuff when I'm actually reading a story. Otherwise, I'm just flipping through. That's cool. That's cool. That's cool. So I wanted to go through. This will probably be a pretty long review. I don't know if I'll do other volumes of the Crepax series or not, maybe, but we'll see. Anyways, one of the things that I think took me a while to get a hold of is to realize what level of reality I'm in at any given time with the Valentina story. And Crepax has a very clear way of denoting that. It takes a while seeing it in stories to catch on to it. So that, I think, was one of the things that held me back. So anytime you're seeing like these little rounded borders like that, you're basically dealing with a fantasy or a dream. And these will get mixed up on pages. And if you're just kind of reading through quick and you're not paying attention to this being, especially because the images themselves are so crazy with so much going on in them, and the compositions are so wild, and like this composition here is so unmoored from gravity in a way that you would like something like this with a strong horizontal feet feels like it has a lot of gravity in it. Something like this is very like anti-gravity in outer space. And so there's just all these complexities going on the page that make it hard to look at already. And then you have these extra little cues you need to be paying attention to. So once I'm like in that state where I'm really invested and I'm paying more attention, then it becomes easier to track. Where what's going on is Valentina is at some kind of protest here, anti-Vietnam protests, and she's here being lifted up by the protesters, and she's having this fantasy, or there's kind of like a metaphor that Crepax is running next to the story, or it's like the way Valentina's processing the event in her mind. It's not clear exactly how you're supposed to read it, but this is not reality. And there, it's, she's having like her BDSM sexual fantasies that are relating to power structures in the real world. So things that I thought were kind of just bizarre, surreal shit at, reading through, I feel like I'm kind of moving from one thing to the next. I don't know what's going on. When I really slow down and pay attention, I think there's actually a lot of interesting social commentary going on in here and a lot of character development going on. It's also, I've pointed this out any other time we've talked about Crepax, but it's hard when we go through, especially this early stuff, not to see the influence on Frank Miller. Like, if you don't see a Frank Miller Sin City prostitute costume design in here and a Frank Miller face in these images, then I don't know. And he has to have been aware of this artist. This stuff is being made in 1968. And there's no way that Frank Miller wasn't aware of this at some point in his career, or it's just a massive coincidence. But I mean, he might as well have drawn that image. Something else that I think made this work really hard for me is that these original stories actually kind of jump around in their production. So that's part of the uneven tone. But luckily, Crepax has signed every page and put a date on it. So this is in 1968, and there are points where we jump back to work he was doing in 65 or 66, and I'll explain a little bit more about what happened there when we get to it. Of course, anytime I'm looking at Crepax's work, his use of gridded structures and musical like polyrhythms within his work, I don't know how much he was thinking about that, but he's definitely interested in jazz and these kinds of things in the work. So I think that's an influence on him. But anyways, what he's been doing, I don't know, how consciously or if it was just, happened in his process, but what he's doing with like cross panel tangents and breaking panels up into smaller subsets, subdivisions and things like that is really, really interesting to me. The video where Sean and I went over Crepax's work, Sean kind of cracked the Crepax code in my mind, and that has become a huge part in what I'm doing in Bound. But images like this, where you have a line cutting across here, pretty much tangent with this, so this splits this top, this panel kind of becomes like this, and this, whereas really it's like this, and this. I really like those. That creates an integration between the whole page, and then further subdividing with the ladder over here, kind of making this sequence of panels out of the ladder, I think is really, really cool. That's the thing. Besides like the mod fashion, I've always liked the 60s mod aesthetic. And so the fact that all of his characters are like that, and there's a lot of that influence in here, it's that kind of structuring and the musicality of Crepax's pages which keep me coming back, even though like this kind of content doesn't bother me so much, the bondage stuff. There's some more intense sadomasochist stuff in the books that I find, and erotic stuff that I find very uncomfortable, but this kind of stuff keeps me coming back. The musicality of her hair across the page is just all really beautiful stuff. This is an even better example of the panels themselves being polyrhythmic structures. So here you have like a 2, a 1, 2, and then you have a long beat here with a 1, 2, 3 subdivision. Then you come down here and you basically get another 3, but that's against 2, even though those 2 are part of a 3. That 2 beats breaks down into another 3. And then here you basically have, against the length of this, you have it broken into 4, but with a 1, 2, and then, or a 1 and then just a 2 or whatever. And then against this much bigger, same width panel over here. So we've basically like split this and this into halves. Then you have this kind of running broken by that. All of these like broken grid lines throughout. I really, really love that. That's part of what I was stealing for Bound. The other thing I was stealing from this for Bound is the idea of like lines continuing between, and that's something he does quite a bit. Another thing, just in terms of the story that you learn, is that Valentina's a fashion photographer, and she's a fashion photographer, at least in the beginning in the 60s, and so you do get a lot of that very op art mod type of designs in these photo sessions that she's shooting. Another really Frank Miller-esque face here. And then at the end, he even has this face that looks like kind of a bad Frank Miller superhero drawing. And she's telling her model, no, too much. You're looking too mean. You look like a comic book villain. And I think that's really interesting. It's even more interesting. Well, here's another one of these awesome gridded pages right here. I mean, it's so musical. I love it. But that reference to you look at too much like a superhero becomes even more interesting when you realize how the Valentina character came about. And I have, like, glancing through the notes and stuff, picked up enough to realize that Crepax originally started in 1965 working on the character Philip Rembrandt. It was like a superhero character named Neutron. So this story, The Subterraneans, was made in 1965. And at that point, Neutron is the main character, and Valentina's a backup character, his girlfriend. And Crepax set out to make like a superhero action adventure strip, and eventually just became obviously enamored with the woman based on his wife and his favorite actress. And she wound up taking over the series. So this is something I wasn't paying attention to when I read this work earlier, is that this story, The Subterraneans, is actually started in 1965, but when you read it, the first page is done in 1968. So once he had made that switch over to Valentina being his main concern, he went back and redid some of the older Neutron stuff to contextualize it within her story, which is more focused on her psychological trauma based on the events that happened in these older works. And to set that up for the future, he kind of went back and revised these. So if you're not paying attention to that, it feels a little strange and uneven as well. And that was one of the turnoffs for me early on. This first page from 68, you see that by 68, he's really figured out that grid style that he's using everywhere, and there's a lot of that gridding and those polyrhythms and the tangents and stuff that show up in the 68 pages. In the 65 pages, he hasn't quite got there yet, and you see that the art's a little bit clumsier. Some really still cool images. I mean, you see an influence going forward on maybe someone like Dave McKean, and artists like that really seem to jump out. Some of the way that the faces are constructed, some of the big chunky marks, things like that, really interesting to me. So in this story, we're introduced now to Philip Neutron. He's at a party and he's getting a call to say, hey, you got to go save Valentina. She got captured by this subterranean characters. But this image here is just a beautiful image on its own. Again, all of that mod, super fashionable stuff. The characters are talking about all kinds of different stuff, different music, different authors they're talking about. Right here, you have a character saying pictorial images only differ from the normal perceptive images in their irrational association. So he's got a lot of really like highbrow smart stuff going on in there. And he's justifying his own work, saying that pictorial images are different from just the images that you get from your perception. And in that, they have irrational associations. And so that's setting him up early on for this train of thought, kind of surreal approach that he takes in Valentina's dreams and memories and those kinds of things. Here we get another one of these panel changes. This is, I believe, supposed to represent a story being told or a memory had. Here we have Neutron having a memory of learning about the Blintana Matanan, and that's part of this language of the underground subterraneans that have stolen Valentina. And that's a myth that he heard as a child that he's revisiting there. So this is another one of those panel structures that we'll see over and over, indicating like a memory or a story being told. As Neutron descends down into the land, the Kamyatan, the city of the subterraneans, there's a really simple but cool panel device here where he's playing again with those rhythms, those just stepping down at even intervals to create the look of a descent. Just simple, but really smart storytelling and panel structure. I haven't quite figured out what these dotted panels are supposed to be, but I'm guessing based on this sequence that this is maybe a dream or a fantasy. I think a sexual fantasy where Valentino's stuck in a cave down underground, and there seems to be a suggestion in the way that in her fantasy she's reaching down towards her legs and is having sex with her boyfriend Philip Rembrandt, and then just the faces here as well. I think there's an implication that even though she's trapped in a cave, she's thinking about Phil and masturbating, or at least having a wet dream or something like that. So I think those imply sexual fantasy. But again, this really beautiful kind of rhythmic structure to the page here. These really beautiful, sparse, like, again, faces that must have, like, look at that. If that didn't influence Frank Miller, I don't know what. Just makes for really beautiful, striking pages. And then the little dot pattern as well is something I haven't seen a lot for a panel border, and it adds a lot of, again, musicality and rhythm to the page. The other thing you'll see here is that these fantasy sequence have been inserted. So here you have the 65 date, and then in here you get the 68 date. This whole sequence here that's focused on Valentina is all done in 68. So this is showing what happened to her. In the original story, you basically just have Philip going in to save her. This shows what was happening to her while he wasn't there, where these characters kind of groped her, stripped her down in the dark, made her dress up in their style, and she was basically molested, accosted, and abused down there. And that sets up a lot of the Valentina stuff, I think, is then intended to be her growing older and dealing with her trauma and how that influences her interior life. So you could see why Crepax came back and was like, I need to revisit this as like the kind of seminal moment of her psychological trauma and come back and give that its own story. Then you flip the page and you're back to 65 now, which is Neutron approaching the city. So just another one of those things that once you really latch onto it, totally makes sense, but also is like, I understand why I was confused by these. It's fun to notice that in this made-up language, one of the characters, the Great Cancer, he's definitely looking at the astrological signs in this story as well as some type of symbolism. I didn't really figure out what it was, but he calls it the Makla Crepaxin, so talking about his own name in there, inserting himself in the story. Then we see the dot panels here used as storytelling. So again, I'm not quite sure what they're being. I don't know if they have a specific meaning or not, but this is the origin story of Philip Rembrandt, in which we find out that Philip himself is like a descendant of these underground people, and that's where he gets his power to freeze people with his eyes from. They also have the same power. That comes up later as Valentina is having to reconcile with the fact that her husband, her boyfriend, is also partly one of these creatures that she hates so much, that she despises. Another really cool musical moment where we have this like beat of the 1 2 3 going across this little platform that this woman's diving from, but then also like that comes down. It feels very much like sheet music to me. And then also the just kind of sine wave arc here going along through the motions. I think that's all really beautiful. Again, strategies that I'm looking at that I'm trying to steal from. On a page like this, I see one of these kind of gateway points where influences come together and influences spread apart. I don't know all of who Crepax must have been looking at, but I do know he was a big fan of Alex Raymond, and I see that in some of these compositions and in some of the way he handles like the stylization of clothes and the stylization of hair. He's definitely got his own approach. Then he's picking up some of this more calligraphic mark making, and it looks like some razor marks. I'm not sure who he's influenced by, but there's a number of other Italian artists I could think of. But anyways, this all seems to be like a pinch point that then comes out, and I don't know. The Munoz Sampaio Alac Center stuff is like in the 70s. This is in 65. I don't know if Munoz was working before that, but it seems like one way or the other. There's an influence with Munoz, the interest in the jazz, and just that kind of same really jazzy art. There might be an illustrator or somebody too that I'm unaware of, that I should be aware of, that they're all influenced by. But then this comes together, and I see also like a lot of Dave McKean being influenced. Again, someone who's really interested in music and jazz, and this just reminds me a lot of like what Dave McKean was doing in Cages and some of his other illustrations, some of his stylizations. So really, really enjoyed these images. These big clustered scenes like this, I think Crepax handles very well always. Another pretty like Dave McKean feeling moment is just a lot of the rendering here on these creatures. These are the Lick and Anaten. These are these monster creatures that are down in the subterranea that become part of Valentina's trauma and fantasies and things like that. But yeah, again, some very Dave McKean kind of feeling, distortions and designs and mark making with the pen. Something else I noticed is that in these earlier works, it is more brushy, more that Frank Miller influence type of thing, more of the Dave McKean influence. As you get into the later stories, Crepax focuses more on these delicate pen lines. I actually kind of like these earlier more like high contrast, brushy, calligraphic images. His later stuff is gorgeous as well, but these are the ones that I really, really respond to. Then at this point, we're now in 1966. I think this is just like, this is 65, this is 66. So he's just flipping over to the new year. So this story must have been played out over 65 and 66, this then with an edit in 68. But this is just more of Valentina being down with the subterranean. She's basically being someone who's being worshipped against her will, and Neutron has to go in and break her out. Back to art that's produced in 68. This is them escaping from subterranea, and they're going past a lot of these archetypal figures, basically these members of the Zodiac. Here's a really cool one where he's got, and I think this is where you start to see his interest in erotica is way overpowering the superhero stuff after just a couple years. But a really beautiful composition where you basically have the same camera view as they're coming up this woman here, but he's managed to compose it so that it feels actually like one big picture, even though the camera is turning. And just the flow between the two characters, the symmetry of it all, I think is just so beautifully handled. In this sequence, we're introduced to Arno Trevis, who's someone that will be part of like a love triangle or a polyamorous relationship with Valentina, Arno, and Philip for a while. He's going to go on some adventures with them. He's a filmmaker who, now that Valentina has escaped from Subterranea, wants to have her star in a TV series about her experiences. So basically is asking her to revisit her traumas, and then is like sexualizing her by taking the costume she's wearing and tearing it up and putting it in this. So there's a weird thing in here about like a social commentary of guys wanting to sexualize women while also being a guy who's sexualizing the women. That's a little weird for Crepax to be playing out, since obviously he's the one choosing to cut up the clothes and draw her like this. But there's like at least kind of a joking self-awareness of what's going on. Once they're down filming, that goes wrong, and they basically start getting trapped in the Subterranea underworld again, so she has to relive her nightmare and she has to get out of there. This is another one of those images. This looks to me like if a Frank Miller jump, if I've ever seen one. It's another one of those ones where I think a lot of the influence on Frank Miller has to be coming from Crepax. I can't even show this whole thing on screen, but there's this really cool fold out here as well that's like a map of the Subterranea, and it tracks basically Valentina's journey through it, as well as like the film crew's journey and where they meet back up. That's just a really fun thing. It's cool to have the big insert like that. Now we're firmly in work being produced in 1968. So these are Arno, Philip, and Valentina coming out of Subterranea, and while they're under, the world on top has shifted from the world below, so they come up somewhere other than where they entered, and it seems like they're in Russia. you can start to see the gridding and the paneling take stronger effect in the layouts of the pages. There's a very explicit call out here to Alex Raymond and Flash Gordon. If you were Dr. Zarkov and I was Flash Gordon, sure, but Neutron leaves it locked. So basically admitting at this point where he's switching over that, you know, his superhero is not as heroic as the people he started out wanting to make a story. And then it leans much more into Valentina from that point on, at least in the stuff that I've read so far. The one thing that kind of irritates me about how Fantagraphics did this is it's not in chronological order. I get why they're grouping it, and I get why this is like the right way to introduce you to Valentina, show where she came from. Like a book that would have just been all the Neutron stuff right out the gate probably would have tanked this series' ability to sell itself. Like, you needed to see the really good Crepax stuff. But there is a little bit where it's hard to totally know how this stuff sits, but it seems very obvious to me that at this point he's lost interest in Neutron. He's gone back and added Valentina to older stories, and now she's the focal point going forward. This page here is a fabulous example of all of the underlying grid work that's going on and the cross-panel tangents that I'm talking about. So you have, like, right here, a lot of gridding going on in the staircase. A lot of that lines up right down to this picture frame here, which lines right up to this thing that she's changing behind. This thing that she's changing behind lines up to the banister here on the railing. There's a lot of cool stuff like that going all throughout. Like, this comes down right into her leg. Here you have a panel that's actually split into two but carries over through the panel. There's a lot. Here's another where these two poles behind her line right up. So basically you're seeing her from the front and the back, and you have the same spot on this folding curtain that she's behind, seen from the front and the back, lining up exactly to each other. And then there's just lots of little things where, like, this line carries over into his arm right there. The hand comes out right from the point where the hand comes out right from, like, the point where her breast and her arm meet right there. Just all kinds of little things that create this. It's not even a flow one way through the image. It's like this series of flows. Even something as simple as basically having this white and black here at about the same size creates like a staggered paneling effect going over. Just a lot of that kind of stuff starts showing up in these and is really, really beautiful to look at. And he does it in a number of ways throughout the book. Here we're having one of Valentina's dreams. We've got those rounded corners. She's dealing with, like, Nazi figures a lot in her dreams. There's a lot of, I almost think, like Kafka-esque machinery, these torture machines that Kafka describes. Again, these like anti-gravities where people are upside down, and then just these really elaborate like costumes and everything. They're visually striking right out the gate, and you see this becoming much more of an interest for Crepax as he goes into these stories in 68. In this particular fantasy, Valentina is thinking about dominating both Arno and Philip. So she's not always the victim in her fantasy. Sometimes she is. She's like reliving her traumas, but other times, like here, you see her in reality versus in her fantasy, and she's talking about having these two guys in sexual slavery. Again, I mean, come on, this is like Frank Miller 300 design, Frank Miller face all over the place here. Really hard not to see that influence. Really hard not to see like how he draws Xerxes or something in the costuming here. So that's really fun. On this page, the cross-panel tangents happen in a different way, so he's starting to explore this idea. Like here you have this whole gutter coming up and then blooming out into like this plant or these fumes that are coming up. There's fumes flying all over the room. Yeah, I guess that's just fumes, not a plant. But then these fumes carry over, like this one carries over here. Her leg turns into fumes. This like curls up there and loops through here. This very obviously loops through there. These come down. It's the same line carrying over. Her fingers turn into them. This moves over into here and then down into there. These come up into this. So again, there's that kind of movement all through the page. That's one of the things that I really like about Crepax, and that I think he plays with even more as he goes on, and that I'm playing with in Bound, is that there, as it should be on a comic page, there's multiple focal points, and there's not even necessarily one right way to move through it, that they can be these like gestalt experiences, and I think he's getting really good at that. He's also starting to level up his composition ability when moving away from the grid. So this piece here, where he has these absolute clusters of like shifting perspectives, characters from different angles, but they all become one image. They're really beautiful, really complex compositions. I did a little sketch here of like all the main compositional lines. The break here, you basically have the two triangles there with this coming across, but then you have all of like the guns like creating triangles up to here, all of the guns creating triangles back, the division here. There's just so much cool stuff. And then you have like characters that are sideways. She's flying in the air. They're shooting up at her. Her size is wrong, but you know, it works because you understand she's up and they're shooting at her, but it still looks like she's shooting at her. Just really, really sophisticated stuff. Thinking about Sergio Topi, I'm wondering, you know, both Italians, I'm wondering who saw what, where, from when. I'd have to go look at my Topi books, but these kind of panelless pages seem very in line with that approach. But Topi is very much about that like totemic image in the middle. Crepax seems very much more modernist in the sense that he's like a constructivist or suprematist composition. He's kind of balancing things on a lot of diagonals, whereas Topi seems to be, yeah, more like this chunk in the middle of the page is how he breaks things up. As the group comes out of the tunnel and comes into this new world of Russia that they've been shifted to, you meet this character Anushka, who strangely to me looks like the sick, thin Angelina Jolie we have now with the very sunken out face. But again, that little two dots with the big lips that you see from Frank Miller. This character then tells them a story. So here she's telling the story of what happened to her previously, her abuses that she's suffered. And you can see, again, he's using that dot pattern. So the dot then is getting confusing to me because I don't always know when it's a memory, when it's a story, when it's a fantasy. I'll be curious to see in later volumes if that becomes more codified or if I can figure out what that is used for versus these rounded panels that are obviously dreams and sexual fantasies. In this one, I think, as in a lot of the art, you can see the influence of like Aubrey Beardsley's erotica work. Also, just some of like images like this have like the compositional use of the figure that you would get from Gustav Klimt, but very Art Nouveau kind of influences throughout. Some, again, really just beautiful like designs on these armors and whatnot. More of these completely wild pages that are like they just, even though there's figures all over them, they read as abstract at first because of the way that there's diagonals going off. I particularly enjoyed this one that works like a number 2. It like flows around like that, and it really leads your eye in a beautiful way as a character moves and is changing perspective. More of this kind of Frank Miller looking designs here. Really cool images. Then you get a history of the Subterranean and how that came to be. I think a lot of the images in here have, again, that Klimt, Egon Schiele kind of distortions of the figure. I also think of like Goya. It feels like these are potentially lost Goya images, these monumental kind of gigantic figures battling. Just feel very Goya to me. So very, very cool stuff. Something else that really appealed to me early on about Crepax, and I don't want people to take this in the wrong way, is that he pointed out to me the compositional beauty of Bondage. I have no interest in Bondage as a sexual experience. I don't find it sexually titillating or anything, but playing with understanding the aesthetic of it was something that like I didn't get until I saw these works, that there is an aesthetic component to it, both in like how you create a composition with the strings, but then also in the composition of how you distort the body to make shapes, and then the interaction of the ropes with the flesh, which he doesn't show so much here, but the kind of contour things that happen when ropes like bite into the flesh and pinch it off. And I think he's done a really good job at least in these earlier ones before things get too perverse, focusing on that aesthetics of it. And obviously there's sexuality and eroticism built into it, but it's not as perverse as it gets later. So I really like these. I just really love these as compositions, and they opened up something in my mind for me, like, oh, I get it, like I get why people could then attach the kind of aesthetic beauty to that, to all kinds of other impulses, and get into that. This story here jumps back. This is one that's produced in 66, and this is now, I think, following up on when Valentina originally got out of the Subterranea the first time. It's a little hard to tell, like I said, how these stories are supposed to be meeting up in terms of the inner chronology, because here you have them meeting Arno, but in another one it seems like she's meeting him for the first time, where he's suggesting the TV series. So the way these stories are jumbled up was also a barrier for me. More of the really cool like mod type of stuff, more of these faces where you can see the Frank Miller influence, the really stripped down kind of version of Crepax, like where he's working with these big brushy blacks and everything's more calligraphic. Especially on a page like this. This is so cool. This is so hip, so mod. Like, this just weird abstract sculpture here. The designiness of this, where like this just an abstraction is beautiful, but then it becomes a part of this, like kind of reverse. The focus on the eye with the characters reflected in it. And these kind of images that can be read sequentially, but also have like this, like I said, gestalt, where you're kind of taking in it as a whole. And it doesn't really matter if this happened before or after this, the time of these things don't matter so much. That's one of the strategies that Sean made apparent to me when we were talking about Crepax that I've definitely stolen. And then a page like this, again, that gritting, the beautiful composition, the way the figures go in and out of the compositions, the cool mod dresses, like all of that's just so cool to me. Then they're talking about, again, they're talking about different kinds of things that they're reading. There's a really cool trick here where you have this character in a helmet facing that way, and then you see her from the other side here. It's just very, like, to me, highbrow stuff for erotica. This page here is a great example of Crepax continuing to be playful with the medium and playful with the form, something that shows up in all of the volumes. Here you have Arno showing some comics that he's made about Valentina. So now you have these upside down where Arno is thinking about her in this lustful, sexy way. You see this page here, and then you zoom into it and it's upside down. Everything's at an angle. Really fun kind of meta insertions of comics within comics. Sean would call that diegetic comics, a comic that exists within a comic. Always a fan of that. And then just the way Crepax uses it compositionally, what he's doing with the lettering and design is really powerful throughout. Then we get an interesting sequence here where a reminiscence turns into a dream, like she's kind of remembering something and slowly falls asleep. We get some other influences like Picasso showing up in the background as she's thinking of the Mademoiselles of the Girls of Avignon. Another one of these diegetic pages here, again with some really cool compositions like this motion here, encapsulating this as part of that image. The fact that he's throwing it to her, it's upside down, all the cool lettering stuff, just endlessly playful. Like, if you're gonna do the same character over and over and over again for so many years, like, have fun with it, and Crepax definitely does. Another one of these cool like meta panel composition things where the wing becomes the ground that they're running on, and then the cave above them, this wing here, cuts up and becomes like the cave behind them. Just simple little things throughout all of the pages that make them feel more unified. Right here, this rock goes over and becomes the rock there, and so there's some like continuity as you read down through there. Really beautiful, subtle stuff that people would probably tend to ignore for the most part. Here he does that same thing, like creating connection all the way down, kind of like what Miel Van de Piet was doing in Centralia Perspective, but here he has these rocky, craggy surfaces that carry down the lines all the way through, like this line cuts down through here. So there's like one rock wall basically behind this whole panel that's making this series of other rock walls seen from other perspectives. Really, really tricky, clever stuff. Then there's an even trickier kind of storytelling thing that really would have been hard for me to pick up on if I wasn't reading these back to back. I read this story a day after reading this story. I can't imagine a big month or two gap between. But you have Valentina exiting finally. They finally getting out of the subterranean and she's exiting. And they're like, Valentina, what do you see? Finally, a ray of sunlight. Then you come to the next story and you're the same thing. You're in a tunnel with her, not exiting the tunnel, but you're just kind of thinking like Valentina in a tunnel. What do you see? She's definitely here being led by people who weren't in the previous story, but starting off in the same context, it almost feels like, what do you see? And this is going to be the continuation, but it's not. You realize that this is a story then that was from 66. So now we're like, this should have been back a little further in the book, but this is all a dream sequence here, and then you come to Valentina waking up. So you start to get the idea of her, like in her dreams, dealing with like these monsters, these Zodiac characters that she encountered while she was in Subterranea. Then Crepax makes it very explicit here that Valentina is struggling with the trauma of being down in the Subterranea area. Philip says, since we got back from down there, she's been uneasy, scared. The doctors told me not to talk to her about it, but they don't know what I know. And then Valentina says, I thought I'd forgotten everything, but at night I still feel like I'm down there. These are dreams, I'm sure, but what about that dark, obsessive world then? So he's setting up this more interesting project going forward of this eroticism is justified as an exploration of her trauma, but also her own interior kinks and things like that. And suggesting that some of her interest in bondage and masochism is due to her trauma, but that doesn't like undermine her actual interest in it. I'm curious to see how that's played out over the other volumes. I think that's my biggest interest is, does he actually carry that out in a way that creates a compelling, well-written female character, or is he just using it as an excuse to like draw her in a bunch of salacious positions? It could go either way. It could be well handled, or it could just be an excuse. And I don't think the material in here really says one way or the other yet. So many of the dreams in the book have fascist characters, Nazi characters. I can't help but think that Crepax, working in 65, 66, I'm assuming, he was a pretty young man at that point. He had to be someone who's like in the first generation of people raised like post-fascist Italy. That must have been a huge concern for him. So the trauma that she's dealing with about authoritarian structures is something that he must have been dealing with often in his life and in his psyche. So to be exploring that through your character in these settings makes a lot of sense to me as well, and I think adds a lot of weight to the work. The first clue I get to how Crepax will handle this stuff going forward is a hopeful clue where you do have Valentina struggling with and realizing that Philip is also half subterranean. Even down there, when those horrible fish attacked me, he managed to stop them in the same way. He's like those blind men. And obviously, that being her lover, she's struggling with the fact that he shares something in common with her abusers. In this story, we're also introduced to a new character named Carolina. Carolina's a rock star. She's going in for therapy, so kind of the standard structure for Crepax there. Sexy, cute chick going in for therapy. Some of the writing in here, too, is so cultured. I think that maybe that's part of what made it hard for me to catch on at first, is like you really have to stop and think about things to understand what Crepax is saying. So here you have the character Rembrandt, and he's describing his musical taste because they're at an opera, and the caption says, Rembrandt, musically a Copernican, doesn't much love the Ptolemaic Mozart and gets distracted. And that's a lot to put into one panel. It's a lot to unpack, but I believe he's saying that musically a Copernican, he likes music with like a steady beat and everything. Like he's a jazz guy. He likes that like kind of steady pulse with all of everything swirling around it, rather than the Ptolemaic where there's like all of these kind of cycling things, which is interesting because Crepax himself seems to love jazz and has all of these polyrhythmic things. So it's interesting that he's got his main character basically not enjoying polyrhythmic stuff or not enjoying polyphony in his music. I think that's what's being suggested there, but it's a pretty dense thing for one caption. So it does lead a sense of like high culture to it. And again, the question that I face going forward is like, is that just a cover up to cover over the fact that he's just drawing sexy ladies, or does it add actual weight to it? I don't know that I've decided that yet. So that story there ends in 66, and that's kind of like, it seems, the wrap up of when Valentina became the main character, and then you get that going back and revising it and moving forward from there. So I'm not even sure that the organization of stuff in this book was the best choice by the editors. Obviously, this is a Crepax scholar who's put this all together, so I'll trust them, but just the arrangement for me made things a little bit confusing. And then we get a huge jump between 66 and this is now 76, where this is a story long in Valentina's future. She's now in her 30s, I believe. Yeah, she's 33 years old. And she's having some kind of psychological event. I don't understand the context for it. Obviously, Philip and her are in a relationship. Again, the highbrow with the psychoanalysis and feminism by Juliet Mitchell. I don't know if that's a real book or not. It would be interesting to look up. But she's having some rough patch here, and is rethinking about the moment 10 years before where she was trapped by the subterraneans, and basically having some kind of anxiety or paranoia or nervous breakdown. You see, this must have been published in some other format because they're taking on these more truncated page styles. And also, he's getting way wilder with the panel structures, using all of these diagonals, kind of breaking the page up in the way that he was, like, the underlying kind of wild diagonal grids that were breaking up some of the full page compositions earlier, the montage sequences. But a lot of really, really interesting stuff going on compositionally. Also keeping Philip here in these rectangular boxes while all of these other ones are at these diagonals, has him grounded in reality while she's struggling with her panic attack. Really cool trick I've seen a couple times now that I've pointed out in a couple videos, but embedding a big exclamation point here where she's, it seems like she's masturbating throughout this sequence, potentially, but there's a big exclamation point there, emphasizing something. Not sure exactly what, but the suggestion is she's enjoying herself. After all of the Valentina stuff, that's like the first 240 or so pages of the book, then you get two pieces because they've decided that this is like horror material. The way that they're organizing this is then to have two other pieces, non-Valentina related, from much later in Crepax's career, where he's doing adaptations of two of the most famous horror stories, the first one being Dracula. This is done in 1983. You can see by this point the stylistic shift in Crepax's work from the early, like, really chunky, brushy stuff that could have had an obvious influence on Frank Miller and McKean and guys like that, to this very, very delicate, illustrative, like, pen and ink style with these long, thin, wispy lines. There's a lot of beauty to that, but some of the power of the earlier artwork goes away. But there's definitely a greater sense of, like, richness and sophistication to some of these images. I do think in this later work you see something that exists at every point in Crepax's career, but especially as he goes later on, is he's always had trouble with men. He's obviously just not interested in drawing men, or his skill set, his ability to imagine. His wife could pose for him and he can't have men, I don't know, but his men are always far inferior in their rendering to the women. They're usually pretty ugly, which works really well here for his rendition of Reinfeld. But when he has guys in suits and stuff, they feel very flat and stiff. Here's his first look at Dracula on the ship. Pretty cool composition with the whole boat, like, tilted sideways there. He's still doing the grid thing. There's lots of cool grid work in this one, like the breakup of the window coming into this, the window being here, lined up with that. Just a lot of that underneath. There's also a really cool, with that rhythmic kind of repetition of patterns going on. There's the rhythm of the wallpaper throughout this story. And then here, this really cool visual where he's connecting the bat face and the feel of the bat outside the window to the wallpaper. And she's talking about what is she looking at. She's asleep, but it's pointing to the window, and she's obviously been like staring at this wallpaper. I really like that technique of just taking off and showing a piece of the room. Again, it's that more like aspect to aspect, like Scott McCloud would call it, approach that Crepax takes that is pretty rare outside of manga until more recently. So I really like those moments where the kind of order of things doesn't really matter. Super Gustav Klimt there. Just need to point that out. It's very Gustav Klimt, Wasserschlagen type of image. The way he draws hips and breasts, very Klimt. This is another one of those very all over kind of compositions where you get all of the elements of the scene that could be happening at once, but your understanding of them develops as you kind of bounce back and forth. It shows the success of later stage Crepax, where he does have all of the little tiny lines, like the more elegant Baroque looking types of things that he'll render work really, really well in this style. So there are quite a bit where I enjoy this style, even though I prefer the earlier stuff. I think the impact of it better. But just the fact that she's laying on the bed and she's like hallucinating forms into this wood grain here. I get that this is all sequential, but it doesn't really matter. Like you just see she's there for a long time, and she's closing her eyes, opening her eyes, closing her eyes, fading in and out of consciousness. And I think that's all represented very well, especially given the fact that he's taking his now what would be very familiar to his readers in the 80s, almost 20 years later. We're moving from the reality into the dream sequence as he rounds out the bottom, and it also makes a cool shape for the whole page. Then as the character moves into this dream sequence or this hypnosis sequence, you get these open kind of montage sequences again. Really beautiful composition, flow throughout the page. Again, like order kind of matters in these, but kind of not. They're very dreamlike and fading in and out. Just beautiful compositions throughout. And this is where you see, his love for the female body on full display, as his love for the female body as a unit of composition, like something that can cut nice shapes and negative spaces, which is a strange, like really oddly objectifying way to talk about a body, but that's, for figure artists, that's what we love. Like, we love the shapes that a body makes, and that he's using that so well within this work. It's just always appealing to me, no matter what the kind of content itself is. You get a good look in this sequence at how Crepax is drawing his Dracula. I don't think it's the most interesting looking Dracula I've seen. Again, his male faces can get pretty ugly, and the way he's handling the just suit and everything in this feels pretty sloppy and pretty mushy to me. Again, it's pretty obvious that he prefers the female form, but I do think when he has some images like this, they can be powerful. And again, I can't help but seeing the influence of a Sergio Topi in a figure like this. Again, Topi would do it a lot better, but some really cool like ink application techniques where there's these dry brush scraped like razor type of techniques, and then he's cutting back into it with the razor, drawing back over it with white. There's sometimes where he's doing that where I like it, like in this case, and there's sometimes where I don't like it so much it feels a little stiff, but some really interesting techniques there. The final story in the book is Crepax's rendition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Again, going back to classic horror. Unfortunately, at this point, this is right before the last thing he finished before his death. This is in 1999. And you can see that his just physical abilities have diminished to some extent. There's a part of that I like where it's bringing back some of those brushier, cruder, more energetic marks that he used to make, but combined with him still trying to do the very like thin line stuff, combined with him like doing the thin line stuff in white, doing some reductive drawing over top of it. The focus on a lot more of these male figures. It's just not his strongest work, which is fine. It's his last thing, and they're collecting it to get a complete collection. But it's interesting to see an artist who just loves drawing, and he's going to keep going no matter what. And he's going to adapt what he can do to that style. I think that's really inspiring. And it's nice to have the whole of someone's career on the table. I do wish, just my personality, that this was all chronological so I could really see it develop in real time. But I get, again, why they've kind of collected the things the way they did to ensure that the series has the most success possible. And I do think it's probably good to get like, hey, here's one where he's kind of shaky. Like, we'll show you all this really cool stuff, and then we'll give you the end of his career. Also shows you like all the different kind of stylistic modes that he has worked in, and sets you up for what's coming in the future. So in that sense, I think it's really well curated book. But my preference is always just to have things in straight chronological order. But you can see here how some of the figure work's getting pretty shaky. I do think there are some interesting, when you're looking at the styles, there's some like commonalities between someone like Teddy Christensen, who I know would have been working for quite a while at this point. I don't know that there's any influence back and forth, but it's hard not to kind of note some of those things and see, oh, like, there's someone else who kind of has this same vibe, but who does it a lot better. And for him, it's just like the system's failing. For someone else, it's the style that they've chosen. And here it's just like the best he can do with what he's got at the time. And that to me is also an interesting, I don't know what to make of it. It's just something I started thinking about when I was looking at this, but it's an interesting thing to think about what that difference is, how you can tell the difference between when someone's really just not able to do their best work anymore, and when someone is basically having the same type of look, but they look in control of it, and so it reads as good. Whereas this, like Teddy Christensen, reads as good to me. This, which feels like Teddy Christensen, kind of reads as bad to me. And that's just in context of knowing who Crepax is. And that extends as the story goes longer. You just kind of see his ability to get the fine line work and stuff fall apart. His ability with the figures falls apart a little bit. But I really enjoyed actually reading what seemed like pretty straightforward adaptations. I'm not sure because I haven't read either of those novels, but there are things in these that are different from my standard view of those. And in talking to Tori, who's read at least Frankenstein, there's definitely aspects to this story that represent what's in the book rather than just the, I guess, shortened version of the story that I'm used to. And then this here with this final page, again, you can see where some of that reintroduction of the crudeness actually works because it focuses him to have these big, like, dynamic compositions. And also, talking about that earlier Frank Miller influence, it's hard not to see a correlation between Crepax falling apart and getting back to these like clunkier, bigger, exaggerated forms, and some of the stuff that Frank Miller's doing now where people have criticized it. I think a lot of it's just bad coloring on Miller's artwork. But that same kind of exaggerated, clumsier looking style that focuses more on energy, I just feel like that type of energetic style worked better earlier in the book. So really, really enjoyed this. Actually really got invested in the Valentina stuff in a way I didn't think I'd be able to. And I got at least one more volume's worth of like trying to really read these stories and figure out what he's up to long term. I guess I'll see if what I hope for the series plays out or not. So maybe I'll do another Crepax video, maybe not. Sorry this one's so long, but I do think it's pretty interesting, rich work with a lot going on in terms of story, layout, art, influences, all that kind of stuff. So really enjoyable. If you hadn't got any of these, I would suggest get at least one of them. I think volume 4 would probably be my recommendation. It's the most formally playful one, if I remember correct. If you don't have at least one Crepax book in your collection, you're missing out. The Eisner-nominated The Strange Death of Alex Raymond by Dave Sim and myself. This is a gorgeously illustrated and designed book. Dave doing most of the illustration. Amazing compositions throughout. What Dave is doing is he's recording his obsession with the death of master cartoonist Alex Raymond behind the wheel of Stan Drake's car when they got into a car crash. The best description of the book that I've heard is that it's like understanding comics with pages like this mixed with something like From Hell when you get into the theories about what actually happened with the car crash. And then with Sean on production, it's just one of the most gorgeously printed books you could get a hold of.
Make sure to like, smash that subscribe button, and ring that bell.